Hi, I'm Naomi Luhde-Thompson from Rights Community Action.
Hi, I'm Hugh Ellis and I'm Director of Policy at TCPA.
And we're just going to be chatting about permitted development rights. So Hugh, what are permitted development rights when they're at home?
Well, the short answer to permitted development rights is they're the thing in planning that makes me want to cry openly the most. but there's a kind of a good reason for that. So originally, permitted development is stuff that doesn't need planning permission. I suppose it's as simple as that. Originally, it was small stuff on householder applications, and then
like a porch on your building or something like that.
Porches and extensions and various things. But the idea was that you could do this stuff because it didn't impact on people. That was sort of the broad test. And then around sort of 2013, someone buried deep in government, inspired by policy exchange, decided that there was a clever wheeze to extend this to other forms of development that had an absolutely staggering impact on people's lives, which was the conversion of almost anything existing building to residential use. So I don't know how to describe that kind of chaos really, but I mean, so just to be clear, you can't explain permitted development, can you, Naomi? I mean, it's just so complicated. So,
so let's start with the sort of basic, where did it start, that first kind of right of converting, to business to office to residential, because that's where it all started, isn't it? The big sort of stuff.
Yeah. So it's all happened in a very fragmented way. But in a nutshell, the government have sort of said at various times that you can convert literally anything. So offices, retail, light industrial, distribution, warehousing, each at different times have had a right to convert to residential use. And the way that the system operates is very, very different to normal planning. Normal planning, you bung in a planning application, the council thinks about what the plan says about planning application and decides whether to approve.
People object.
Oh yes, that little thing. People have a chance to object. But this time, and of course, there's planning committees and various other sort of stuff that people are familiar with. But what the government is after is to create, I mean, what they're after in the end is to make all planning like this. But the way prior approval works is that you have planning permission already effectively. Yes, you can do it, subject to a few real minimalist tests, which you have to demonstrate that you've dealt with. And so those are things like, flood risk, a little bit on transport, and they vary between different parts of permitted development. So that makes it complicated. And then the council can only think about the things listed on that the government give them to think about. They can't think about the development plan. They can't think about carbon or green space or health or all the things that for people like us, I think, make a difference to a decent place to live. And that's why essentially they have such a huge impact. People are losing control of their towns and villages. I know a lot of people, it's about urban areas, but in fact, there are other forms of this, the Park Q forms, where you can convert a barn, a farm barn, into residential use that was previously storing tractors. I've seen some really, really terrible ones of that. So
yeah, I suppose it's the impacts in urban areas like on our high streets, or it's the bad neighbour aspects that are really going to come home to people, because you might be living in a flat and next door suddenly they've completely changed the use, or you find yourself living on an industrial estate in a car park because they've changed an office building to a series of flats.
Yeah, so I mean, when I sort of flippantly said at the beginning this was the stuff that made me cry, I think if you're a planner, the idea is on a good day you're creating spaces where kids can walk to school, where you've got access to services, where there's green space, where you can live a reasonably healthy life for you and your family. But permitted development literally means that industrial estate starts to become residential, and of course the standard that stuff's converted is very low, and you then have seen children playing in industrial estate car parks where there's no walkable shop.
Mm-hmm.
And when a country sinks as far as that, when you've lost your moral compass as a government as far as that, it's actually very difficult, I think, for people like us to respond and for communities to respond, because it's just so staggering. People just can't believe it. And sometimes I think people still haven't caught up with particularly how bad it's going to be on August the 1st, when the English planning system effectively comes to an end, when most development in urban areas will be permitted development.
Yeah, and it's going to be quite difficult for people, because the thing with planning is it's happening all around us all the time. Decisions are being made. You know, we look at the site notices, we get to object. We know there's going to be a discussion at committee if it's a big application. You know, all these sort of processes go on and it's in the news. Now it's just going to be individuals, they own a property, pretty much can do what they like with it. And suddenly we'll start to see these things happening around us and there will be nothing we can do. There's just going to be nothing we can do to stop it or change it or to say, this is not the sort of place I want to live.
No, if it's not listed in the prior approval matters, and things, as I said, things like design are not listed, you know, health, climate, carbon, those things are not listed. Yes, you can think about flood risk, you know, so there are one or two things. You can't think about this broad set of ideas that go to make good places. So yeah, if a community comes to us, and as you know, Naomi, I'm a miserable sod because I've worked on planning reform for too long, but if a community comes to us now and says, I want to do an urban neighbourhood plan, you know, I've got a town council wants to do a neighbourhood plan, I'll tell you what I'd say to them, what's the point? What are you going to control with this neighbourhood plan? Your local plan is totally pointless. How do you do town centre renewal? How do you spend the money from the town's fund effectively when your town centre can turn itself completely into something else overnight? You've got no control over it, or no effective control over it. And the problem with all of this is that when key shops and various other things go out of retail use or whatever and turn residential, they never turn back. You know what I mean? That's it. You've lost it.
Yeah.
That's why, interesting. It's not just us lot who are worried about PDR. British Property Federation, lots of other organisations who want a retail future for town centres. They are wanting on.
Yeah.
You know, that's a challenge for them.
It's one of those. Yeah, I was going to say, it's just one of those incremental changes. It's like, you know, there's like various different owners on your high street. So all of them are going to be doing their own thing, not really asking anyone else, not kind of really planning it at all. It's not part of a bigger picture. And so you've got no idea where it's going to end up. So it's nothing, nobody's agreed any of this. They're changing all these rules through statutory instruments. So nobody's voting on it, essentially, at the moment. It's not like we voted somebody in to get them to do this. This is all happening behind a lot of closed doors and a lot of policy. And it's not really, you know, happening as part of the public debate. We're just kind of, there is some debate about the aftermath and about the impacts of permitted development that have already happened. But it's not, you know, it's not something that you realise and that you can then do something about democratically, as it were. I mean, because the only thing you can do is pray against. So
yeah, I mean, it's one of the biggest shifts of power from local government to central government in planning there's ever been. You know, local government are just losing. What is the point in local government in many places? You know, bless them, they just lost all their power. I think the situation on planning was already very centralised. I mean, Robert Jenrick just gave a blanket planning permission to an enormous amount of property. I mean, anything in a town centre that's, you know, that's less than 1,500 square meters, which, by the way, is pretty much every shop you can think about, unless it's the really big ones. You know, it's almost everything in a town centre. And just said, no, free hand. And that goes, you know, that along with the fact that they've changed, and this is really boring, but it's important, they've changed the use class order. So the Class E, classification, all the kinds of development used to be divided for good neighbour purposes, as you were saying earlier on. That's all been effectively driven into each other, so that light industrial and retail and commercial uses are now all part of one use class. And that use class, Class E, can all be converted to residential. And then if you corner them because they know they've done wrong, you know, it's like kids with their hands in the cookie jar. They can't, you know, one can defend this stuff because the evidence, as you were saying, is overwhelming that it's producing really terrible outcomes. They'll say, oh, well, we've introduced a light standard because we were producing permitted development flats with no windows. And there's a lot of no window flats out there. So you've got, which is, last time I checked, quite important for your mental health. So the government plays this basic cons people. There's no way around it. It says, oh, we've introduced a rule that has to be natural light. And then we all go, oh, that sounds like good, until you work out that's not the right to a window. That can be one of these tunnels from three stories above.
Yeah.
Living at the bottom of a bloody well. I mean, the fifth economy on earth, well, for God's sake. You know.
I'm sure you still get a window in prison, but maybe not in a
you get more
flat.
You know, who knows about it? You know, I'm sure if we complain about permitted development, we're likely to end up in prison, like state things. But you know,
Yeah, it's
space
dangerous
standard
stuff, criticising.
criticizing. But the space standard is another issue. The government sort of, after massive pressure and outrage about people living in 8 square metre flats with no windows, has finally said, well, from April the 1st this year, we have to apply the national space standard to this stuff, the 37 square metres, which is not generous particularly. But, you know, there's this sort of constant pushing them to try and do the bare minimum. But even with that, they won't accept that design should apply to permitted development. You don't have to think about design. And again, you know, well, let's be absolutely clear. People will reap the consequences. It'll be bad for town centres commercially. And the important point for you and me, I think, is that no one's arguing that, by the way, that you shouldn't convert redundant buildings to housing. I mean, there's a really strong case for doing that where it's appropriate and to the right standard, and where the services exist to support people.
But you can do that anyway. I mean, it's like you don't need PDR to do that. You can do that anyway. It's no problem.
And the lesson for town centre renewal is chaos doesn't work, never has. What you need is a guiding hand, a master developer, call it what you like, and that probably needs to be somebody that's accountable, like a local authority.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like responding to COVID. It's like, did we require lots of regulation, lots of organisation, lots of strategy? Yes, we did. Not that I'm saying that it was a brilliantly strategic move on behalf of the government, but the point is there was lots of regulation around. There was lots of organisation. And I think that, you know, the point about permitted development rights is you're basically saying, well, there was this public right where we made a public decision on whether or not something, you know, should be residential or whether it should remain a business. And now we're basically saying, oh, that doesn't matter. You know, anyone who owns it can decide. And by the way, you don't have to give any money to the local authority on the scale that you were giving before if you were, you know, creating a new development and putting funds through Section 106 into public services and the things that communities need.
I mean, that point is really, really important, because the thing that the real estate and property owners wanted to get out from under, as was the Richard Desmond case with Robert Jenring, was to get out of contributions for affordable housing, because that's the biggest ask the local government makes on private sector developers in terms of development values is money for genuinely affordable housing. So permitted development, as you say, doesn't give you any Section 106 money. So you can't generate affordable housing. You can't have money for built realm. You can't have money for transport improvements. So this is as much of a disaster for local government trying to regenerate a town centre as it could possibly be. What you get is the frontage changes. So you get partly retail, partly shops, and then the shops themselves begin to fade away, because ironically, bringing people back to town centres as customers is one thing. Bringing people back to live in town centres can work if it's handled really carefully. But people won't go to town centres if there isn't a retail. You know, it becomes a housing estate. And the problem with that is that town centres are totally ill-equipped to be housing estates. They don't have primary school. They don't have the infrastructure, you know. And the only way to get the infrastructure is to have Section 106. So what tends to happen in reality is not this dream of, you know, that the government has of a free market, of a free-for-all generating wealth. What happens is Terminus House Harlow, where office and retail units get turned into low quality, because actually most of the buildings are time expired. So who's going to do the big way? They get turned into low quality private rented accommodation. And housing people who tend to be vulnerable on low incomes. And, you know, rather than building those people proper houses, properly socially rented homes, you're essentially creating, you know, this is why people have talked about the slums of the future. Because we decided high rise was a bad idea, particularly for people, you know, with multiple needs. But we're doing it again, consciously creating high rise housing for people in most social need in the wrong place. And the problem with that is that, like high rise in the 60s, it took about a decade for people to work out that had been a terrible bloody mistake in this country. I know it works. In this country, a terrible mistake. But
we're still kind of not out of that. I think that's the problem. It takes so long, and the impacts are happening to everybody, and we're not all talking to each other about how these things could impact us, and we're not kind of gathering together in the way that you'd need to be to have this big constituency and saying it's just not on the way development is happening.
I think that's
so that kind of collective action, we really need to start thinking about how do we talk to each other, how do we share the stories of what's going on, and support each other, because this stuff is all going to happen to us. There are going to be all these problems, and the only way to turn it around is to basically change the law back, to take those rights back that have been given to private property owners, essentially, from the public.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. This is a human story. It's not really about classy and PDR and those terms. At the end of the day, it's about the obscenity of a government that takes the interests of property and ideology to such an incredible extent that they're willing to house people in such appallingly bad slum condition, knowing that that is the consequence, because let's be clear, it's been pointed out to them throughout the research that UCL have done. And that's why I think it's just so shocking. And that's why people will be picking up the pieces. We'll be having to buy these places back. Who's going to refurb a 1960s office block? And I think the heart of this, as you've raised, the heart of this is about care. This is the evening. We sit here talking at the evening on the 5th vote on the cladding issue, the fire safety bill, where there's an outpouring from Grenfell Tower about why the government won't bring into scope and provide proper compensation and legal redress for all those people who've suffered not from their own for their own action,
not at all.
Clad in flammable material, buildings that
competence
material, because the government did not care essentially about the consequences. What they cared about was delivery and numbers and the property and property sector. And until you see planning and the built environment from the point of view of human health, well-being, from the point of the needs of future generations, you're always going to be in this problem.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I agree with you. I'm quite, in a way, bizarrely optimistic, apart from weeping into my soup about PDR, because I think they've underestimated how much people do care and how angry people are. And God help them if all these different groups of people angry about planning as it is now, about PDR, about cladding, God help them if all those people were to ever meet in the room and suddenly work out that they have one single shared interest. That shared interest is having a government that gives a damn about outcomes in planning and the built environment. Yeah. And if they were all to get together, not of course that we would dare suggest such a thing, Naomi, but if they were to get together, and that
I think we're stronger together. I think with the new sort of planning legislation that's going to come up, more planning reform, which is on the horizon, I think it's a massive opportunity that we all need to take to actually talk about what, the planning that we actually want. Because I think permitted development rights, because it's happened through these statutory instruments, nobody really understands the process of how they get passed through Parliament. Private individuals then take advantage of them, so people can see it sort of popping up here, then everywhere. The researchers look at it, they go, this is a disaster. And it starts to have some kind of news coverage and some sort of public debate, but it's not got enough traction at the moment. It's like not good enough response because it's not happening to quite enough people. But I think once it starts to fall out, people just have to say, I want something different. And with COVID-19, meaning that we've all been much more home-based, we've all sort of had to work much more from home, we've been much more within our own neighbourhoods, we've stayed local. I hope that sort of sense of like, well, actually, what is in my local area? Can I actually live in my local area? Is it just, is there just nothing here for me? Starts to get people thinking about what sort of place they actually want to live in and how those decisions are made about the sorts of places that we live in.
And I agree. I think the gulf between the potential for highly sustainable living in cooperative and caring environments is so staggeringly huge. We know more about health, well-being, climate, and we can see cities around the world and places in Europe doing it so much better. The gulf between what we're delivering, particularly in England, because this is England stuff. Yeah. It's a basket case in Britain, obviously, on planning. It's well behind Scotland and Wales now. That gulf we have to bridge across that. I think people just feel they have to accept what they're given. The interesting thing about it is that when planning was invented, it was a moral question partly. Everyone deserves to live in basic conditions which support their health and well-being and give them best potential for a good life that they can get. And that was a moral question. And I think that because planning has become very technical, we've been robbed of that campaign. The sort of campaign you're talking about, sort of principles that we're talking about, is exactly what we need. We need to tell people life can be better. Your kids don't need to live in pollution. They can live the good life, but only if you start thinking about space and place and planning from the point of view of everyone, not from a narrowly defined group of people. It's not about real estate, and it's certainly not about the development sector on their own. I'm very happy for them to be at the table. I just don't want them to be the only people at the table.
Yeah, I think when a community is ever at those sorts of tables, though, I mean, really, we're not.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. But
we're not at those tables, really. And I also think that there's this whole concept about planning, that it's about the money, it's about real estate, it's about, financial value, and I think that's really, really difficult to cope with when we all have to live in that. I don't want to live just on somebody's bank balance sheet. I want to live in a real place, real people, and which has real quality, where I can, walk to the park and breathe clean air, and live in a home that's dry and warm. I mean, this is what people actually want. And, how that, equates or translates into a bank balance sheet, I don't really, that's not what's important to me. I think that's the really big issue about having planning that's just driven by figures, and pound signs essentially, and planning that's driven by values.
Well, I can't disagree with any of that. I think the interesting thing for me, after 30 years of planning reform, is I'm interested in what works. The current development model, the volume house development model, regeneration model, doesn't work. Okay, so it's not a question of whether or not we're being utopian thinking we should suggest something else. It doesn't work. It doesn't produce the amount of affordable housing. It doesn't produce zero carbon homes. It doesn't produce healthy lifestyles. It doesn't produce sustainable transport. It doesn't produce anything critical to the future of our society. So the question to ask is actually a very practical one. If the current model does not work, how can we have a different model that does work? And we've done that before many times in this country, when we've had a view that, at least in part, communities and public sectors should have a stronger voice in the delivery of homes. And if you take that as being the solution, you have to look who's building the most passive homes in this country at the moment. Probably Exeter. But they're doing it through direct delivery as a local authority.
Yes, now, exactly.
If the private sector volume house builders had a good business head on, that have seen the opportunity of environmental standards, seized it and run with it, like many other business in parts of industry in any other sector. But instead of doing that, they've resisted it, bitterly resisted the fact that we need to get down this road. Yeah. And as a result of which, we've cast ourselves classically in Britain in building, 1950s solutions to 21st century problems. And that's bad for the economy, bad for people, bad for the innovation of this nation. But you will get there when you get yourself hooked on that relationship. So, yeah, I look forward to it. If people come together and ask for higher standards, then we'll do them. And I'm remember the funny story about how whenever you say to industry, let's have higher standards, they scream costs. And it was a group of developers in the 1920s had a campaign to defend back-to-back terraced housing in Leeds because it was cost effective, even though people burnt to death trying to get out of them. There was an enormous campaign by the private sector about having to build inside toilets in the 1950s when that became a requirement. Every damn step to improve living conditions, there's been a voice saying, break the business. Now, what we need...
But it's never broken the business. You see, that's what I find. It's just so kind of mean, isn't it? It's like they know it hasn't. It's just a bunch of, it's just a story that they're telling to keep their profit margin, as high as possible.
Look how much tax.
Where's the pride in that? Where's the pride in the built environment? Where's the sense that you're doing something for something more than a profit?
There's never been less. Yeah, I mean, there's exceptions, and there's good developers, and there's good social developers as well. But I have to say, there's never been less pride in the built environment than there is now. I mean, you look at some of the mining villages built, for God's sake, by mine owners in the 1920s. I mean, they're to a standard much higher than anything being delivered now with the front and back garden. Think about the 1919 standards, where, you know, the sort of minimum space standard for a cottage designed small house is about 50, 54, 55 square meters with the front and back garden. Minimum.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Well, now you get 8 to 11 square meters without window, and no outside space whatsoever, apart from, you know, the car park.
So we've lost our way really badly, and we've gone down a rabbit hole thinking that the private sector will be able to do this. And while there's good and bad in the private sector, they are incapable on their own, left to their own devices, profit maximizing devices, to deliver the society we want. So we're going to have to think differently. And I think my mind is very open about that, but I do know that public sector, cooperative, social models, self-build, set within the context of high standards, is potentially transformational.
Yeah.
But only if you can get a government who thinks this is about human beings, and that we do not have yet on the planet.
It needs to be about people. And yeah, I think we need to decide what's happening locally, even if there's a different structure to that, or there's a different way of making those decisions. It has to be done, you know, collectively, because so many of these things result in stuff that nobody ever wanted or voted for, and we're kind of left stunned by what's going on around us, because nobody ever asked us if that's what we wanted. Did we want PDR? Did we want our high streets to turn into a residential? Did we want to put our most vulnerable people in a car park? Well, if you ask anyone, they'll go, well, no, I didn't want that. You know, who wanted that? So these things are just, you know, the way our government is working at the moment and the way these things happen, there seems to be just parallel tracks. And I'm just, you know, we need to get back some sort of power over what's happening in our place. And I think we can do that really powerfully if we all say we want it. Yeah, I mean, that's the crucial thing, is that we've all got to say we want it. We want to have the right to have a say over what happens locally. Absolutely.
I mean, indeed, and that's not easy. It's complicated, but it's fundamental. You either give communities democratic power or you don't. And at the moment, the government has done something that I regard as being one of the most amazing success stories in political messaging ever. In 2009, pre-2010, they published open source planning, if you remember that, which was a document they published in the run-up to the 2010 election, talking about how they hated the previous regime's top-down targets and centralisation. Give power back to the people through things like neighbourhood plans and the Localism Act and various other things. And, you know, indeed, neighbourhood plans, perhaps in many ways, are the only thing in the last 10 years that's been interesting and potentially positive. But at the same time, in the last 5 years, they have done exactly the opposite by stripping powers away. So you can still do a neighbourhood plan, it's just pointless. Yeah. So where is the commitment to local empowerment? Where is the commitment to local democracy? And the reason that, you know, the centralisation is taking place, because left to their own devices, people start asking bloody difficult questions about the future of their places. They start investing in it, start having views. God, some of them I approve of and some of them I don't, but it's not down to me or anyone else, is it, to judge what's acceptable. And so the language that's used, particularly internally in the corridors of power, the vitriol against NIMBYs, for example, you know, the vilification of people who get involved in planning because somehow they're not in line with what the government's agenda happens to be that morning. That is very wrong.
It's very wrong, because my God, it's so important. It's someone who cares. A NIMBY is somebody who cares about what's happening. Now, they might have a selfish interest in it, but they still care. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that you can go from caring about what's happening, you know, in your local area, whether your neighbour's annoying you or not, to it's a care about place, isn't it? That's what it really is. That's what it fits into the bigger picture. And what they're basically saying is we can't stand people who care about their place they live. And I mean, we all live somewhere, and to not appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, we all care somewhere, and we all, and let's be honest, we're all involved in campaigns. I'm incredibly pro housing. I'm incredibly pro the need to deliver social housing, and I think we can deliver places which would meet people's needs, and that would be a struggle. You've got to persuade people that development is necessary, but you can only enter into the persuasion job if you can tell people that they will genuinely meet local needs and lead to better lives. And you and I both know that the average bolt-on estate that's being built in the average town and my town does none of that stuff.
Yeah.
Just, it's just a way, yeah, there is need for general demand housing, huge need. With 1 million unbuilt permissions, 350,000 plus consents a year, planning system is basically not the problem. The problem is that the development sector doesn't want to build out fast, and the quality of what's being built is terrible. So everything that goes up just adds to tensions and divisions and makes communities angry and more bad-tempered about the fact that service provision isn't there and the GP surgeries are over full, or the public transport is knackered, or whatever it might be. I tell you what, this isn't planning. This is just chaos theory, and the idea that it's going to work out well is a lie. And so there's a big cleaning up job to do. You're of a generation that can do it. Of course, I'm too old. I can just retire before it gets too bad.
I'm not sure that's terribly fair. I'm thinking it's a multi-generational, intergenerational project that we're taking on here, with the people who kind of lived through it and the people who are going to have to live through it. So yeah.
I was being silly, but I actually.
Well, I'm not letting you off the hook, Hugh. You're not walking away.
No. I think you're
right.
I think that planners have to, like me, have to get out of their box. We have to reconnect with people. We have to reconnect with the values of the practice we're a part. We have to be proud of that utopian background, by which I mean the idea of living an ideal life and aiming for that. And we have to make sure that we're there to defend above all the public interest. And planning is not there to service the needs of one particular group. It is there to build this tricky construction of consensus in any place about how change should happen. People very often, well, in my experience anyway, my limited experience, people, yeah, there are the odd, very, very selfish, difficult, when they're everywhere, that's life. But on the whole, communities actually have a really good nose for what should happen. And then when given the opportunity, actually come up with some really good progressive solutions to stuff. Yeah,
I think everyone can be a planner, and I think if we take that attitude, everyone can be a planner. So, let's all do planning together.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, isn't it? It's a challenge and a choice between chaos, and chaos keeps us poor, and it destroys
collective action.
And collective action and democracy. So at the end of the day, what's interesting to me about this conversation, Naomi, is where we've ended is that actually this is a campaign for democracy. It's a campaign for a better future. It's an argument about whether or not we want to build slum housing again. We were very good at that 100 years ago, or whether we want a better future for people. I don't want my kids to live in this crap. I honestly don't. It's an obscenity, permitted development, and the things it produces. So I'm going to be really controversial and say, I want that vision to be, let's have that passive house with a reasonable sized garden where you can grow some food. Let's have that highly sustainable development, and development will need to take place, but it will enhance nature and our lives, not destroy it. Which was something we could talk about 100 years ago, but now seems apparently to be off the table, doesn't it?
It was lovely talking to you, Hugh.
It's always lovely to talk to you, Naomi, about it. And although I know it's quite a relaxed conversation, but I hope people take from what you've said, particularly that the need for a collective response to this is really, really important. 1st of August, democratic planning in this country effectively comes to an end in urban areas, and people should care. They should be fired up. Ring up your MP, who knows less about permitted development probably than local campaigners do, and get them to get off their butt and do something about it before it's too late.